At the end of the 19th century, it was the British Empire that was under pressure, and a war between Britain and Russia over China seemed imminent. Although Germany faced a potentially hostile Franco-Russian alliance in Europe, in Africa and the Far East, it was often able to cooperate with these two powers against Britain. By 1907, however, the international situation had undergone a sea of change. It was Germany that was isolated, and Britain had settled its most acute disagreements with both Russia and France. Anglo-German relations had deteriorated to a point where war between these two before friendly powers was a distinct possibility. In any war between the Dual Alliance and the Triple Alliance, it was safe to predict that by 1907 Britain would join France and Russia. The main causes of this dramatic change, which some historians call a diplomatic revolution, are as follows. Some of it was the growing Anglo-German commercial rivalry. There was also the construction of a German fleet. The Anglo-Japanese alliance of 1902 made Britain independent of Germany in the Far East. Then there was the Franco-British Agreement of April 1904 that at least marked the end of Anglo-French hostility over Egypt. And then lastly, there was Germany's violent reaction to French claims in Morocco. And, I forgot, Russia's defeat by Japan in 1905 made Russia less of a threat. Between 1900 and 1914, Germany became an economic giant. The German steel and iron industries, protected from foreign competition tariffs, could undercut rivals abroad by selling at some 40% below the current price. Germany had also started progress in developing chemical, electric, and engineering industries, which were going to be forefront in the Second Industrial Revolution. By 1910, Germany also possessed the second largest merchant fleet in the world, second only to Great Britain. German exports dominated the Middle East, South America, South Africa, and largely displaced British goods there. Inevitably, the German economic miracle was a challenge to Britain's long commercial and industrial supremacy and caused considerable anxiety and hostility. In retaliation against German imports, there were growing demands in Britain for the end of free trade and the introduction of tariffs. This in turn led to German fears that they were about to be shut out of British markets and to increase demands for the acquisition of a larger German colonial empire. Above all, it was the Anglo-German naval arms race that inflamed public opinion in both countries. The British government responded to this new challenge from Germany by modernizing the Royal Navy and designing in 1906 the new Dreadnought battleship, which made every other ship afloat obsolete. This, however, only made it easier for the Germans to catch up, as it inevitably reduced Britain's overwhelming lead. Thus, when in 1908 the Germans announced a supplementary program consisting of 4 capital ships per year for the next 4 years, often hysterical demands in the British popular press and skillfully orchestrated campaigns by the Navy League pressure group pushed the British government into agreeing to building more ships. In 1909 to 1910, and then again in 1912, attempts were made to find a formula which could diffuse the dangerous tensions generated by the naval race, but each time there were just objections to the settlement, either from the Germans or from the British. The French were determined to occupy Morocco. Plus, Morocco was on the verge of a civil war, and the restoration of order by the French seemed a better option than anything else to the British. Ultimately, the French hoped to associate Britain with the Franco-Russian dual alliance, while the British government hoped that an Anglo-French colonial entente would lead to a similar agreement with Russia. The agreement was signed on April 8, 1904, and settled Anglo-French colonial problems in 3 main areas. The French exchanged their fishing rights around Newfoundland for territorial compensation in West Africa. Present-day Thailand was divided into 2 zones of influence. And then lastly, France agreed not to block British plans for financial reform in Egypt. While it improved Anglo-French relations, it is important to understand that this agreement was not an alliance, since neither country was committed to come to the help of the other in the event of war. Arguably, together with the Japanese alliance, it made Britain even more independent of continental entanglements, and it was only Germany's violent reaction to its provisions for the French control of Morocco that turned the agreement into a virtual Franco-British alliance against Germany. The German Chancellor, Count Bernhard von Bülow, decided to challenge the right to control Morocco, which had been given to France by the Anglo-French Agreement. Optimistically, he believed that he could destroy both the dual alliance and the Entente Cordiale, which was what the French call, whatever, and that a new Russo-German alliance would emerge, which would effectively isolate France. In early 1905, the French government, ignoring all warnings from Berlin, began to reform the Moroccan administration. The Kaiser interrupted his Mediterranean cruise to land at Tangier and greeted the Sultan of Morocco as an independent ruler. The Germans then demanded a conference on the future of Morocco and the resignation of the French foreign minister. At first it seemed that Berlin would really win a significant success. The French cabinet agreed to a conference and forced the French foreign minister to resign. Then, in July, Kaiser and Nicholas II of Russia met and signed a defensive alliance to cooperate against any power in Europe. Yet all these successes were purely temporary, and by April 1906 Germany had suffered a crushing defeat. The Russian government never ratified any agreements and let them lapse, and France was significantly strengthened when the British government came down firmly on the side of the French. When the conference began in a city I'm not going to even try to pronounce, in January 1906, Germany secured the backing of only Austria and Morocco. The other 9 states agreed that France had a special interest in Morocco. Together with the Spanish, the French were therefore entrusted with the supervision of the Moroccan police, while France was also given control of the state bank. However, the Germans did win the concession that all powers should enjoy equal economic rights within Morocco. The Moroccan incident was, as the historian A. J. P. Taylor has stressed, a true crisis, a turning point in European history. I feel like he says that a lot, but okay. For the first time since 1870, a Franco-German war seemed a real possibility. There were no armies or fleets mobilized, but the senior official in the German Foreign Ministry, Friedrich von Holstein, and the German military high command were certainly ready to risk war, as Russia was weak and the French army was inadequately equipped. In December 1905, I'm not recording this, guys. You know I always do this towards the end. Anyways, in December 1905, the Schieffelin Plan was perfected for a two-front war, while the British and French military staffs also began seriously to discuss what action should be taken if Germany invaded France. The Anglo-Russian Entente of 1907, like the Anglo-French Agreement, was initially not aimed at Germany. The British had long wished to negotiate a compromise with Russia that would take the pressure off Afghanistan and northern India. On the Russian side, the Anglo-French Entente and Japan's victory in the Far East made an agreement with Britain necessary. It had little option but to improve its relations with London if it was to maintain its alliance with France. The Anglo-Russian Agreement was signed in August 1907. Like the Anglo-French Agreement, it was concerned only with colonial matters. The Russians gave up all claims to Afghanistan and recognized British interest in Tibet. Persia, or the present-day Iran, was divided into zones of influence. The north went to Russia, the south to Britain, with a neutral zone in between. And then lastly, both empires recognized Chinese sovereignty over Tibet. Germany had a chance to reassert itself in May 1911 when French troops intervened after riots against the Sultan of Morocco had broken out. It soon became clear, contrary to their agreement in 1906, that France was going to occupy the whole country. The German government immediately insisted on territorial compensation from territory in the French Congo. Initially, the French government was ready to negotiate with the Germans, as the Russians, still resenting the lack of French help during the Bosnian crisis, made it clear that they could only offer French help and no military assistance at all, meaning they'd give advice, but that was it. The British were also anxious to prevent a German diplomatic success, which they feared would destroy the Entente, but they were also signaling to the French that the British must not be ignored in any new Moroccan agreement. In fact, the warning was seen as an ultimatum against Germany, and it made a Franco-German compromise much more difficult to achieve. In the end, through secret negotiations, the French reached an agreement with the Germans in November 1911, which allowed France to establish a protectorate over Morocco, provided that Germany was given a small part of the French Congo, and its economic interests in Morocco were respected. Essentially, this was another diplomatic defeat for the Germans, as they failed to extract any major concessions from the French. The Second Moroccan Crisis had very serious consequences for the peace of Europe. It heightened tension between Germany and Britain and France, which fueled the arms race and made Germany increasingly desperate for a diplomatic victory. The German government, pushed by the army, public opinion, and a highly effective pressure group, increased the size of the army by 29,000 men. The French, meanwhile, compensated for their smaller population by extending the period of conscription from 2 to 3 years and by modernizing their artillery and equipment. Russia had to rebuild its armed forces after the disaster of the Russo-Japanese War. By the financial year of 1913 to 1914, Russia was spending over 800 million rubles on rearmament. By June 1914, the peacetime strength of the Russian army was on target to reach almost 2 million men, which was 3 times as large as Germany's. Another consequence of the Second Moroccan Crisis was France was determined to strengthen the Triple-Entente. A Franco-Russian naval convention was signed in July 1912, in which both navies agreed to work out joint tactics in the event of war. The French and Russian military chiefs of staff also met and decided that should war break out with Germany, both armies would immediately attack. At the same time, talks between the British and French naval staff also took place about the part each navy would play in the event of war with Germany in the Mediterranean and the English Channel. In November, the French and British governments exchanged letters defining the Entente. In essence, they stated that the naval and military agreements between the two countries did not constitute a proper alliance, but if either state were attacked by a third power, they would immediately meet to discuss whether they would take any joint measures. This was as far as the British cabinet was willing to go. By the end of 1912, both the dual alliance and the Anglo-French Entente had been greatly strengthened. Germany, facing isolation, was consequently all the more determined to cling to its alliance with Austria. It was this that was to make the Balkan crisis of 1908 and to 1914 so dangerous. The Triple Entente was not a formal alliance, but it did mark a shift in the balance of power in Europe. No longer could the Germans assume that an Anglo-Russian war would break out that would enable them to force Britain or Russia into becoming an ally with Germany. The Entente did not, however, completely remove all friction between their members. Anglo-Russian friction continued, for instance, in Iran, nor did they necessarily mean that Germany would be isolated and encircled. There were still influential voices in France arguing for a settlement with Germany. In 1909, the French and Germans even signed an agreement for economic cooperation in Morocco. Yet by the end of 1910, Franco-German relations were again rapidly worsening, as local officials in Morocco were breaking the agreement by steadily increasing their power and administration, economic and financial affairs. As a result, this is going to cause more armament of Navy, military, and much larger armies to be developed between 1912 and 1914.